Hi, this is Gila. So this evening, as I'm recording this, it's September the 3rd. It's the 80th anniversary of the entry of France, Britain, and its then empire into the Second World War. And I'm afraid I've also got a bit of a cold, so please excuse my voice and my red nose. But I felt I really wanted to make this tonight because it is the 80th anniversary. Of course, today, only people in their 80s and over are likely to remember much of any significance directly about what living in wartime Britain was like. However, of course, many of us alive today may not remember the Second World War ourselves, but have strong memories of our parents or grandparents or other relatives recounting their memories of what it was like to grow up during this time. Personally, I remember my late mother telling me that on this very day, September the 3rd, 1939, 80 years ago, as an 8-year-old child, she was waiting in a train station to be evacuated with her younger brother. Both my parents spent nights for months on end, sleeping in bomb shelters at the bottom of their London gardens when German planes attacked nightly during the Blitz, starting promptly at 6 p.m. each evening. Both lost many months of schooling, and my mother eventually left school 2 years later at the age of 20 than she would otherwise have done as a result. And indeed, my mother's school in Catford in London, Sandhurst Road School, was bombed in January 1943 when she was still only 10. 6 staff and 38 children were killed, some of them friends of my mother's. And 60 further people were injured. Indeed, my mother would tell me how she believed she was only saved because she regularly walked home to eat at her house each lunchtime. And she vividly remembered seeing a German pilot so close in his airplane that day that she could even see his face. She dodged among the houses when trying to get back home to try to avoid being seen by this pilot because she was terrified that he would attack her. And years later, she would always cringe in fear whenever we watched old film on TV of German bombers flying in the sky. She loathed that noise. Of course, all of us who have or who had family who lived through the Second World War, I'm sure have our own passed down personal recollections of tragedy, of sacrifice, of everyone pulling together. There was tremendous courage with everyone doing their bit, whatever it took to work for Britain's eventual victory. And my late father would recall that no one ever doubted that Britain would win the war, even in the dark days of 1940, once Western Europe had fallen and Britain and its empire stood alone against the Nazi terror of Germany. And a lot of civilians died in bombing raids and explosions. Of course, many soldiers died too. Overall, throughout the whole world, it's been estimated that some 75 million people died as a result of World War II. But Europe, well, at least the western part of it, and Britain was saved from tyranny, that of a supremacist, oppressive, hateful, and violent ideology, Nazism. Aryans, especially blonde and blue-eyed ones, although Hitler himself was neither, were the desired people. Others were less so, like Slavic peoples and gypsies. Its particularly hated enemies were the Jewish people, and a third of the entire world Jewry at the time, some 6 million people, were murdered by the Nazis. It was only 80 years ago that Britain declared war on Germany. Churchill took over as Prime Minister a year later in 1940, and he led the British people with dogged determination throughout the grueling half a decade which followed. After the end of the war in 1945, rationing was even worse for a time in Britain, and some rationing even lasted up to 10 years until 1955, and national service until 1960. Other notable memories from his youth, which my father would recount, included the 2 years he spent in the army under national service in the early 1950s. Now, it may be very difficult for us, or those of us who are younger than 80, to imagine what life was truly like for the British people in wartime. But without their many difficult sacrifices, Western European civilization would have collapsed into tyranny, and our hard-won freedoms and human rights would have vanished accordingly. And yet, today, in the Britain of 2019, our freedoms and human rights are gradually being eroded, not by Nazi jackboots this time, but by our own, or rather, certainly our successive governments' stupidity. Now, political correctness may have originally arisen out of noble motives, but it's rapidly become a stultifying and unimaginative catch-all for anyone even slightly right, of extremely liberal and left-wing, anyone who does not believe in open borders, moral relativity, LGBT brainwashing, and who appears to show even the faintest whiff of supposed bigotry, Islamophobia, or any kind of racism, however unlikely or inaccurate that reality may be. Our mainstream media is no longer objective. It is self-censoring and shutting down any real discussion of the real threat from today's supremacist, oppressive, hateful and violent ideology which successive governments, especially from the time of Tony Blair, have opened our doors to. That of Islam, as written in its sources of the Quran and Hadith. Can you imagine, in the Second World War, anyone for a moment refusing to read or discuss the details of Hitler's Mein Kampf and his whole Nazi ideology because the most terrible thing you could be was to be racist against Germans, and you didn't want to be falsely accused of being a racist? Can you imagine Churchill for a moment saying that of course we had to open our borders to any German Nazi who wanted to destroy our own values and civilization, because it would be unfair and bigoted of us not to do so? No, of course. Any such suggestions would have been completely ludicrous. No one would have thought such ridiculous things. We were at war with Germany, and it was a war that would only be won with the complete extinction of Germany's fighting ability. But we're not at war now, are we? Well, tragically for us all, the reality is that in a sense we are. Indeed, the whole of Western Judeo-Christian civilization culture has been at war for the last 1400 years. We haven't wanted it. That war was originally declared on us and on all other non-Muslims by Muhammad himself. As non-Muslims, Kafirs, we are supposedly deeply hated by God himself and by Muslim believers, according to Quran, Surah 4, verse 35. We are confused, 625. Muslims should not be friends with us, 328. We are disgraced, 3718. And Muslims should make war on us, 929, and terrorize us, 812, until we are defeated and subjugated under Islamic rule with far fewer rights than Muslims. And vile anti-Semitism has been part of Islamic ideology since the time of Muhammad. So, while of course we need to be very clear that the problem lies with Islamic ideology, not of course with Muslims as fellow human beings, why on earth are we continuing to allow yet more immigrants who have been brought up to believe this ethically deeply problematic and frankly dangerous creed to be true? Why are nearly all British politicians, all mainstream media, anyone with any real power in this country, refusing to face actual facts about Islamic ideology? Why instead are we allowing more and more of our freedoms, especially freedom of speech, to be lost, while allowing ever-increasing arrogant demands for special treatment for Muslims and Islamic beliefs to become more and more dominant, gradually turning ourselves into suppressed and deliberately humiliated dhimmis, like Christians and Jews of old living under Islamic rule? Isn't it just as ridiculous to do this to ourselves today as it would have been for Churchill to have opened the ports of Britain to any German who wanted to come here in World War II? Some of them were not Nazis. Some may not have wanted to kill us. But a substantial number of Germans at the time would have wanted our defeat and would have done everything they could to make sure that happened. So, next time some ignoramus falsely accuses you with the knee-jerk reaction, if you dare criticize Islam as an ideology of being a bigot, a racist, or an Islamophobe, remind them just how many good people suffered and died to protect us all as British people from a similarly oppressive, hateful, and violent ideology back in the 1940s. Thank you so much for listening. Okay, 1.5 weeks to go until Tommy Robinson is finally freed from his totally unjust sentence. Okay, have a good evening. Goodbye.